Okay, I'm going to be talking about four things. I'm going to be talking about science and the way we define science and scientific fraud. I'm going to be talking about scientific data and who is allowed to see the scientific data. I'm going to be talking about regulators and what they do. And I'm going to be talking about individual responsibility in science. And I'm going to be talking about how problems in each of these areas have led to a major crisis of credibility in the validity of a lot of science in medicine. There's a huge amount of history here, which I'm not going to discuss, a history of a large number of medical scandals, many hundreds of thousands of deaths involving misleading science, involving drugs particularly. I'm going to just cut through the history with one quote from Albert Einstein, his definition of insanity. Insanity, he said, is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. Perhaps we can start, first of all, just by discussing what we mean by science in the first place. Now, the UK Science Council in 2009 spent a full year working out what they called a new definition of science. And they claimed what they thought might be the first official definition of science ever published. And this is what they came out with. Science is the pursuit of knowledge and understanding of the natural and social world following a systematic methodology based on evidence. Well, that's quite an achievement for a year of work. And the problem is that there are lots of these sort of pontificating scientific bodies, particularly in this country, who produce lots of nonsensical things like this, but don't actually react or respond to any of the real scientific problems that are occurring in the real world. Perhaps more relevantly, we can look at some of the norms of science from this chap, Robert Merton. And he discussed four norms of science. These are unusual science. Communalism, this basically means that everyone can see what's going on in proper science. Universalism, the doing of it is not restricted to special people. Disinterestedness, an arm's length attitude, you're not being paid hundreds of thousands of dollars for producing certain results, and what he called organized skepticism, that claims are exposed to critical scrutiny and are capable of being exposed to critical scrutiny, and we able to ask awkward questions about science and the scientific process. And science needs all sorts of people, and in particular, it needs these people who are going to ask these awkward questions, and it needs for the data that these awkward people need to look at to ask these awkward questions to be made available to those awkward people. And if we have systems in science which disable awkward people, perhaps like me, from functioning, or disable those awkward people from seeing the information that they need to ask these sorts of awkward questions, then we really have quite a dangerous system of science. And certainly in medicine, a large part of what we do does fall into that kind of category. The first example I'm going to give is of a Mr. Nobody. Now, what I've indicated from the last slide is that there shouldn't really be any Mr. Nobodies in proper medicine, but this is a Mr. Nobody, and I'll explain in a minute why he's called that, and his fight with JAMA, the Journal of the American Medical Association, a very prominent medical journal. Now, in 2008, in JAMA, this publication appeared, and it's a paper comparing the use of a drug with problem-solving exercises to try to prevent stroke, to prevent depression in patients after a stroke. So this is a very common problem. And after this paper was published, the lead author of the paper went out in the press and made these sorts of comments. I think every stroke patient who can tolerate an antidepressant should be given one. Now, after this paper was published, this chap over here, Jonathan Leo, a fairly obscure scientist at a fairly obscure medical school, wrote to JAMA and pointed out that, in fact, in this paper, there wasn't a great deal of difference between the two arms of the study, and he couldn't actually even work out from the paper whether there was a statistically significant difference between the two arms. This is in a major medical journal, and it would be quite helpful if the authors could provide more information. JAMA didn't publish his letter, so he went off to the BMJ. And in addition to the British Medical Journal, and in addition to what he'd pointed out in the other letter, he also pointed out that the study had been funded by Forest Pharmaceuticals, the manufacturer of this drug, and that neither the JAMA article nor the subsequent media accounts noted that the author had served on the speaker's bureau for the manufacturer of the drug. In other words, what he was doing was going around saying good things about the drug and getting paid tens of thousands of dollars for doing so. The JAMA editors then responded to this letter in the BMJ in a slightly unusual way. The JAMA editor responded by going out in public and calling this critic a nobody and a nothing. She then went further and phoned the dean of his medical school and demanded that he had to approach the British Medical Journal to retract this letter, on what grounds I don't know, and suggested that he should probably lose his job as well. There were sort of more articles about that. And then JAMA went further, and they produced the so-called new set of complaint compliance rules, which basically boiled down to the fact that a new set of rules for JAMA, that readers of JAMA articles in future have to approach JAMA editors for advice before going and criticizing any JAMA articles in public. So this is real science from a major medical journal. After that, there were some other newspaper articles which I think kind of shed light on the whole thing. Forest Pharmaceuticals, the drug manufacturer, was accused of fraud by the American Justice Department for illegally marketing antidepressants in children and adolescents without evidence. There were other articles talking about the amount of money that these spokesperson authors for Forest Pharmaceuticals were getting, sort of $750,000 for writing these sorts of articles and appearing as Forest Star spokesman. And Forest Pharmaceuticals paid a $300 million US government fine over allegations that it gave kickbacks to doctors for prescribing its drugs. Now, there are obviously lots of issues here, but the one thing I want to pull out of this is whether this kind of behavior by a journal editor actually constitutes some sort of scientific misconduct, scientific fraud. She's acting in a way really with an intent to disturb the scientific record. So this is the next thing I want to talk about, is really about scientific fraud and scientific misconduct in medicine and how we define it and how people try to define it. There are lots of discussions of this, books on the topic. This is a recent book published in this country, supposedly about fraud and misconduct in biomedical research. This is actually a pretty bad book, apart from the fact that it actually has got a reasonable discussion about what happened to me. But the discussion about me is pretty reasonable. But really, these days, if you had a book about fraud and misconduct in biomedical research, given what's happened in the last 20 or 30 years, you would expect 2/3 of that book to be devoted to problems and fraud in the pharmaceutical industry and on behest of the pharmaceutical industry, and in particular, problems at the university-industrial interface. You wouldn't get any of that impression from this sort of book, and the reason is perhaps not surprising, and this kind of relates to who's dominating the discussion of these kinds of topics in this country. So the editors of this book are Frank Wells, who's a doctor who used to be head of the ABPI. Now, the ABPI is the UK lobby group for the pharmaceutical industry and some sort of regulator of the pharmaceutical industry. And Michael Farthing, who is Vice-Chancellor of the University of Sussex, who works closely with Universities UK, who has the sort of job of keeping up the good image of UK universities. And he also runs something called the UK Research Integrity Office, which is the regulatory body of sorts which claims to be the regulator of scientific conduct in biomedical research in this country. Now, in the 5 years of the existence of this research integrity body, I'm not aware of a single case of research fraud that it's exposed. And it seems to be a body which is much more concerned with hiding research fraud away. So it has a set of procedures for people wanting to raise research fraud, which would really put the fear of God into anyone who wanted to raise research fraud through any of the mechanisms other than those they prescribe, which basically means sort of going through sort of formal secret procedures and so on. Now, if you read these kinds of things about scientific fraud, you'll hear about these sort of classic cases of scientific misconduct, like William Summerlin at Sloan Kettering, who faked transplant experiments in mice by painting black patches on their skin. These are the classic cases. V.J. Soman, a diabetologist who wrote 12 invented papers. Robert Slutsky at UCSF, who published 137 papers, one every 20 days. Most of them were faked. Or John Darcy, a cardiologist at Harvard, who was observed faking data by his very prominent boss, Eugene Braunwald, who ignored the problem completely, and data investigations discovered more than 100 fraudulent papers. These are important things. The problem is that the way these odd cases are discussed, you kind of get a very strange impression of them, because the stories as they're usually told minimize the involvement of senior colleagues, which we know about in these cases as well. They minimize the role of university administrators, hospital officials, regulatory bodies, who spent years hiding the misconduct of these people for years before it was eventually exposed. And also the choice of these cases sort of implicitly defines what these people mean by scientific fraud. So if you look at these cases, you'd gather that scientific fraud is rare, that it usually involves a particular kind of odd activity, like painting black spots on a mouse, that it usually involves a single aberrant person, almost always a male, acting alone and duping otherwise honorable collaborators. And this kind of idea is made very explicitly by people who should know better in very authoritative positions, like the president of the National Academy of Sciences in congressional hearings about scientific misconduct. Problems of scientific misconduct are rare, the product of psychopathic behavior originating in temporarily deranged minds. And if you have this idea of what the problem is, then the solution is to create yet more procedures and guidance, and for universities to create robust, secret, legalistic procedures to investigate these sort of rare rogue people. The problem, as Arnold Schwarzenegger put it, is that it's all bullshit. The reality is that scientific fraud is not rare by any means, and it's also not by any means an individual activity, but it's a group activity. It involves group collusion, and I'll give some examples of that. There's this idea of sort of groupthink. Hannah Arendt, who wrote mainly about sort of the Nazis, called the sort of rule by nobody. So what you have is you have a system where no single individual feels in any way responsible for what's subsequently done. And indeed, many people have gone to great lengths, as in the Nazi things that she discussed, to create that exact situation. So these go to great lengths to make sure that this is the exact state of affairs that's achieved, a state of affairs where you have a rule by nobody. And these legislators, ethics committees, and so on are involved in this. I'm not going to go into all the sort of details of how it happens, but the question is the extent to which these kind of system designers are actually responsible for some of this fraud that takes place. The reality, as I've indicated, is the offender is often not a lone white male psychopath, but sometimes a corporation, or a corporation acting at the university industrial interface, or in fact a university itself. I'll come back to that issue later. Or a journal editor, or a regulator. This is a very important report, the 2005 House of Commons Select Committee report into really basically into the functioning of the UK drug regulator. And the question is what the government actually did about that at the end of the day. Or the offender could be government itself. The mechanisms of the fraud also differ quite significantly from the sort of painting of a spot on a mouse idea. The mechanism of the misconduct is usually not direct fabrication of findings, but something sort of much more nuanced. It's very difficult to define, but I think this kind of idea, Potter Stewart was an Associate Justice of the US Supreme Court, and he was involved in an important case, or a case where he had to define what was meant by hardcore pornography. And he came out with this comment that hardcore pornography was hard to define, but I know it when I see it. And I think the same kind of thing applies to lots of these kinds of things in science, that it's difficult to define what we mean by scientific fraud, but practically everyone in this room would recognize something as being inappropriate scientific conduct when they see it. What's definitely certain is that scientific misconduct has got nothing to do with the correctness of a conclusion. So to err is both human and scientific. It has to do with behavior. And in particular, behaviors which could, and don't necessarily have to, but could disturb the scientific record. And it's obviously not a binary thing. There is a gray zone, but I think we need to get away from these sort of attempts to have sort of formal definitions of what we mean by scientific fraud and start discussing these kinds of behaviors. Science is an open thing, and discussing bad things in science should be an open thing in the same way. I'll give the second example here, which involves just a very small thing, but it was a junior doctor that approached me for some advice. I was a consultant in pathology. She was a pathology trainee. And she had a problem which she sort of painted as a practical problem that she had, rather than a scientific problem. In order to gain her pathology registration, she had to submit a dissertation, and she'd done the work for the dissertation, but she couldn't write it up, and she couldn't prepare the work that she'd done for publication because she said that her supervisor had made this impossible for her to do for years. She was only allowed to present and write up the secondary aspects of the work that she'd done, which she was finding extremely difficult to do. The problem was that the work involved looking at some physiological changes in healthy volunteers who were randomized to getting atorvastatin, a cholesterol-lowering drug, or placebo. And what she'd found in the study is that atorvastatin probably induced a diabetes-like state in these healthy volunteers taking this drug. And her supervisor was funded by the manufacturer of the drug. Since this work was done, there have been a huge number of other studies which have shown exactly the same thing in different sorts of ways, but her work, as far as I know, has never been published. Now, the problem is that people who discuss scientific fraud wouldn't actually regard this as fraud, because they regard fraud as fabrication, falsification, and plagiarism of data. No falsification has taken place here. Nothing's been fabricated, and there's no plagiarism, so there's no fraud. End of story. Here's another example. Does Seroquel, an antipsychotic drug, cause diabetes and weight gain? Now, I'm not going to discuss the drug itself. This is a big issue, but I'm just looking at the sort of mechanics of this thing. So this is a paper that appeared in the International Journal of Psychiatry, 2000. It's got a bunch of academic authors working at universities, and they produced this paper which said there was minimal overall weight change observed over 18 months of treatment with this particular drug. Okay? And the question is, what relationship these authors have with this data that they're presenting on behalf of AstraZeneca, a UK pharmaceutical company. There was a cloud on the horizon here because the Food and Drug Administration were beginning to look at this whole issue of diabetes in patients on these kinds of drugs. They wrote to AstraZeneca, and then someone noticed the obvious thing that, in fact, they had more than 18 months of data on these subjects. And basically what had happened is they'd taken that and turned it into that. Okay. So the question here is, what is the role of these authors? What information were they given at the time of writing this paper? What information were they given as subsequent to this paper? And it's the whole issue of sort of authorship in science and what these people were actually seeing. Here's another example. This is one of the rare examples where people have authors of science have challenged pharmaceutical companies to get data about which they're writing and have been refused access to that data. Now, I'm sure, as we're discussing in the coffee break, there's been lots of discussion about public access to scientific data. What we're talking about here is a much more fundamental thing. We're talking about whether the authors of scientific papers have access to the information about which they're writing. So this is Famivir, is an antiviral drug used for treatment of herpes. And in this particular publication, there was a 9-year delay before there was partial publication of results, which happened to have bad implications for the sponsor of this particular study. So what happened? These people got a research grant to do a clinical study looking at comparing this drug Famivir, which was produced by SmithKline Beecham, now GlaxoSmithKline, again, a UK pharmaceutical company, to compare their drug with a competitor's drug. And at the end of the study, the sponsor didn't give the randomization codes to the people who'd done the research, so they weren't able to write up the study. Okay, this is how it appears in the publication. This is the paper that eventually was published. This is the conclusion. This competitor drug appears to be somewhat better than GlaxoSmithKline's drug, who sponsored the study for suppression of herpes. And I'll just read exactly what they wrote in the paper about what happened. In 1997, SmithKline Beecham, now GlaxoSmithKline, initiated two separate trials to evaluate the comparative efficacy of the two drugs in the suppression of genital herpes. Despite study completion, the data from these two trials were not made available until the product was subsequently bought 9 years later by Novartis, and the report describes the results of these two studies. Recent publications have discussed issues surrounding lack of publication of trials that yield negative results or results that are unfavorable to the sponsor. We acknowledge that the process of analyzing data for publication beyond a study endpoint and preparing a manuscript is labor-intensive, and companies are understandably wary of devoting resources to a report that is not in favor of their product. We appreciate that Novartis, a completely different company, made these data available after their own in-house review, although what they received was just the data tables and listings for the study. We were not able to obtain data tapes to verify the analyses and to conduct what we consider to be the most clinically relevant analyses on their own study. Okay, so the other question here is, what are scientific data? And pharmaceutical companies and regulators, indeed, like to make us believe the data is the same as representation of that data. So in other words, if someone gives you a graph or a table which they say represents something to do with the data that they've got, that is somehow the same as giving you that data. So that's obviously nonsense to anyone who's involved in real science. So it's like getting a hamburger when what you actually want is the cow. And blinding in these kind of studies refers to study design. It doesn't refer to blinding of authors or regulators. Here's another example that I'll give. This is an example involving Vioxx. Now, one of the biggest scandals in medicine involves this drug Vioxx. And it's been estimated that probably around about 300,000 people died as a result of inappropriate use of this particular drug and bad science involving this particular drug. I'm not going to discuss the sort of scandal or the science of it, but again, just to give you examples of the way this system works. So this is a newspaper article from the New York Times discussing one of these Vioxx studies, 2006, discussing the fact that Merck admitted to a pretty crucial error in the analysis of data in one study, so what they called an error anyway. And what's interesting is really the language of the newspaper article. So this is what we read. Merck and co. acknowledged that it had misidentified a statistical method. Merck contended that the study showed whatever. The company said in a statement yesterday, Merck insisted that its argument holds up, and so on. It's all got to do with Merck, but in fact, this is the scientific paper. These are all the university academic authors fronting this paper for Merck. When something goes wrong, these authors have absolutely nothing to say. And the question is what contribution these authors actually had to this paper. Did any of these authors actually analyze the data, look at it, check it, anything at all? Here's another example, just again from Vioxx, just to show how the thing works. This is another trial of Vioxx, the Advantage trial. And I'll tell the story of just one single 73-year-old woman. This in October 1999, this 73-year-old lady died in a clinical trial of Vioxx. And the trial was Merck's Advantage trial. And she died a few minutes after calling her son to tell her son that she felt short of breath. This trial was a very short trial, just a 12-week trial of Vioxx. Despite the fact that it was a very short trial, 8 people in this study taking Vioxx suffered a heart attack or sudden cardiac death during the study, compared with only 1 patient who was on the placebo. And this difference was statistically significant, but Merck never showed the data that way. And in the published study, there was an author, Dr. Lissay, at the University of Arizona. In the paper, the 8 deaths became 5, a difference which suddenly wasn't statistically significant. The paper never mentioned the other 3 cardiac deaths in patients taking Vioxx, including the 73-year-old woman. This is the paper, author Jeffrey Lissay. When approached by the New York Times after this is what Dr. Lissay had to say. He said that while he was listed as the paper's first author, Merck actually wrote the report. Merck designed the trial, paid for the trial, ran the trial, he said. Merck came to me after the study was completed and said, we want your help to work on the paper. And the initial paper was written at Merck, and then it was sent to me for editing. The results of the trial were also supposed to be blinded when they were coded. But what in fact happened to the 73-year-old woman that I've just told you about? Well, during the coding of patients in the study, Dr. Eliev Bar at Merck judged that the woman had probably died of a heart attack and coded her in that way. Okay, now the reason we know about these things is from information that emerges in litigation. Litigation is the most important source of information about how science operates, but litigation shouldn't be part of the scientific process. So this Merck employee coded the woman as dying of a heart attack. And what happened to him is that Dr. Ryson, another Merck employee, immediately sent him back an email and said, I think that should be called an unknown cause of death. And a few hours later, she wrote to him, I would prefer an unknown cause of death so we don't raise concerns in a supposedly blinded study. November 2001, an FDA reviewer who examined all the company data also concluded in a report to other agency officials that Merck had cheated, but the FDA didn't tell anyone else either. And Dr. Lissay, the study author, said he'd never heard of this woman who died until the New York Times told him about it. Merck have been involved in all sorts of other shady deals, for example, creating fake journals. So Merck paid Elsevier to create a number of fake scientific journals. This came to light in 2009 in the context of a lawsuit again. And Merck had designed these journals in such a way that the average reader would mistake these journals for proper peer-reviewed journals. And surprise, surprise, all the articles that they published favored Merck drugs. Here's an example of one of these journals. I'm interested in skeletal medicine. This was their skeletal one. And what you see in this fake journal is a huge editorial board consisting of many of the great and good in skeletal medicine in the world. This is what one of them said. One of the people approached by the press on this fake journal said he didn't ever recall who asked him to serve on this journal. You get involved in a whole bunch of things at this level. Elsevier issued a press release and an apology. We published a series of sponsored article compilations on behalf of pharmaceutical companies that were made to look like journals and lacked proper disclosures. This was unacceptable and we regret it. But what are these academics involved and their institutions? Absolutely nothing happens to them at all. I'll end off just by talking a little bit about the sort of regulators of these sort of systems. And there are many sort of systems that allow this kind of thing to happen. I'll say a little bit about medical writers or ghost writers and how they sort of oil this process. A bit about medical journals, the MHRA, the UK drug regulator, and there are a few other kind of ethical systems that I probably won't really have time to discuss. There's this quote from this movie that I like, Syriana, with George Clooney. And there's a scene in it which has got to do with regulators. And this is a quote from that movie. We're looking for the illusion of due diligence, Mr. Pope. 2 criminal acts successfully prosecuted. It gives us that illusion. And this is a lot of what regulation is about. What about ghost writers? Well, I've had something to do with medical writers, as they like to be called. And in fact, there's not something universally wrong with medical writing. At its best, having a medical writer help with a scientific publication might not be fundamentally different from having someone who's good at producing nice graphs for publication produce a nice graph for a publication. But in reality, a lot of what these medical writers do is really oil the process, which allows scientific authors to become dissociated from the data about which they're writing. The medical writers like to sort of say that they're doing nothing at all wrong, but in fact, this is quite an interesting sort of quote from Adam Jacobs, who's a sort of very prominent UK medical writer. He used to be the head of the European Medical Writers Association, and he's one of these people who think that medical writers do absolutely nothing wrong. And this is him writing in the British Medical Journal about data. So this is the ghost writer writing in a thing in the medical journal, and what he says is, when the time comes for publication, the medical writer writes the publication in consultation with the named authors. This usually begins with discussion between the medical writer and the authors about the main features of the paper, after which the medical writer writes the first draft. The draft is then revised, sometimes many times, after review by the authors. Thus, although the authors do not actually write the paper, they do have control over its content, which is far more important. Naturally, they have access to the report of the study, in other words, the pharmaceutical company's report of what the study analysis showed. They often don't have access to the raw data, but it's worth repeating that raw data are of very little use when writing a paper. Results of a study need summarizing and analyzing before they mean anything, and it's those summaries and analyses that are important for proper interpretation of a study, not the raw data themselves. And these are the sort of key medical writers, and here he's really rationalizing the key thing which has led to most of the scientific fraud at the university pharmaceutical interface over the last 20 years. What about medical journals? Well, I won't say much about them. I'll just sort of take a side swipe at the British Medical Journal. This is the sort of blurb of Which magazine. No advertising, no bias, no hidden agenda, just expert advice from an independent source. This is the blurb of the British Medical Journal in its information for advertisers. We protect our reputation by careful balance of editorial and advertising, which means that your messages will always stand out. Good stuff. I won't discuss any of the other regulatory systems apart from the MHRA, which is the UK drug regulator. So the MHRA has absolutely nothing to say about the problem of ghostwriting. They have absolutely nothing to say on the problem of denial of access to data to authors or to the scientific community in general. They had absolutely nothing to say about what happened to me in Sheffield. And they even suggested that it might be, in fact, illegal for me as an author to obtain the randomization codes that I've been denied in a study that I was writing because Procter & Gamble owned those randomization codes. So this is the level at which they think. I, in fact, wondered at some point whether the MHRA might, in fact, have the randomization codes from the studies I was doing, because these were the key 3 studies that were used to gain regulatory approval for this particular drug, risedronate. So the MHRA licensed this particular drug. And a general person in the population might have thought that if the drug regulator licensed a drug, they must have actually looked at some data relating to the drug before licensing it. So I put in a Freedom of Information Act request to the MHRA. Did the MHRA receive and scrutinize in any way the raw data relating to the 3 key clinical trials which led to approval of risedronate? And has the MHRA, in fact, got the randomization codes in the study? So first they sent me a response along the lines of, we can't tell you because part of the response is commercially confidential. So in other words, it's commercially confidential for me to know whether the drug regulator scrutinized raw data before licensing a drug that I'm prescribing. Okay. I then replied again that I'd simply asked for a yes or no answer, and which parts of yes or no are commercially confidential. And eventually, after a long, convoluted exercise, I got a response that the MHRA had not, in fact, scrutinized or retained any actual data at all before licensing this drug. None of this is terribly surprising at all. You can read it all in this House of Commons Select Committee report, which is the last thing I'll discuss, on the influence of the pharmaceutical industry from 2005, and these are just quotations from the report. Practices have developed which act against the public interest. The MHRA relies on company data presented as reports in its decision whether or not to license a drug. Raw data is very rarely analyzed. The MHRA chairman suggested that trust underpinned the stance of the MHRA towards the companies they regulate. We infer that this extended to the routine acceptance of companies' summaries of the results of tests on their drug as true reflections of the raw data on which they were based. Evidence that the regulatory agencies are acquiescing in biased publication of the information they hold. Lack of transparency has played a major part in allowing these failures to continue. 100% of the funding for the MHRA comes from the industry it regulates. And in view of the findings, we recommend a fundamental review of the organization. Well, nothing has happened at all, but effectively, what we have is that the drug regulator is doing exactly the same thing that academics are doing in their interface with the industry, writing and fronting information about which they have no data whatsoever. I'll probably stop here because I'm running out of time, but I was going to discuss General Medical Council and a few other regulators, but I'll probably stop at this point and hand over to David.